I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we return to a frequent topic on the podcast, insider threats. More specifically, how insider threats are presenting during the employee hiring process. You may have seen that there are widespread reports of North Korean nationals seeking, and in some cases, gaining jobs in the United States and in other Western countries outside of North Korea, sometimes following a fairly sophisticated plot to fool hiring professionals and circumvent hiring processes. These tactics have brought new attention on how organizations should be managing insider threats during the hiring process and what should happen when North Korea or other sanctioned company seeks to become your next employee. To discuss, I've invited my teammate, Dan Ongaro, a frequent guest on our podcast, and one of our outside partners, Landon Winkelvoss, a co-founder of NISOS, a cybersecurity and digital investigations firm. Each of us have worked these cases, both from an incident response and from a legal perspective. And I'm so happy that we are able to bring our collective thoughts on this issue together on this podcast. Landon, Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Maybe, Landon, I can maybe ask you to just get us kickstarted here. And maybe from your perspective, do you want to describe a little bit more about how these cases are presenting and how you have seen them unfold with your client organizations?
Yeah, for sure. Again, thank you for having me on the show. I think I'll defer to my colleague, Dan, to kind of discuss, what the implications really are with DOJ. But from our perspective, how we've seen these with employment fraud in general, you have polyworking, which is really routine IT worker scams where somebody gets a job, they're not qualified to do the job, and they outsource it to somebody else, right? With the DPRK, it's certainly much more complex. What we're ultimately seeing is a pretty sophisticated, organized ring of individual contributors and really facilitators, based here in the United States, that ultimately are getting jobs for North Koreans. And really what we ultimately see is there's less on the technical indicators and much more with regard to what we see in HR indicators. And that's how we usually start to see some of these, right? With typical polyworking or IT scams, somebody's not doing the job well, and it kind of surfaces to HR. With DPRK, it is much more complex. These individuals a lot of times are qualified to do the job, but they're not showing up. When they pull the indicators back and start peeling the onion back, you're seeing some basic social media analysis. There's clearly somebody who is not who they say they are. When you just do basic social media analysis, the person that is on the I-9 is oftentimes somebody that's very different in the world. Oftentimes we see references. The references that are listed are sometimes the same person as the actual applicant. That's usually how these cases come to us with our clients. We get these types of cases of like, this just looks fishy. And then when they start peeling the onion back from the HR indicators, they typically see, that they have VPN access that's coming from, Asia. You see unauthorized remote desktop software. Then you start seeing the more traditional technical indicators. And that's kind of what we get brought in.
Yeah, interesting, Landon. And so for the audience here who may not have used the phrase DPRK, that's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, otherwise known colloquially as North Korea. And I think what we are seeing is this practice that you were just describing, particularly coming from that country. And Dan, as we've seen these cases unfold, is it is just as simple as where there is a public posting for a job. And then, some people apply for that job, and it turns out that they, as Landon pointed out, are not qualified for that job, but are looking to get that job for some nefarious purpose.
Yeah, it certainly sounds simple on the front end, but as Landon mentioned, there's a lot more going on the back end for the process, but certainly a lot of times for a hiring manager or someone doing an interview where there may be some small indications, it's not necessarily something that stands out compared to a typical job applicant.
Some clear sloppiness, right? That is giving the triggers that Landon, you were describing, from the references to, perhaps some of the VPN access and I want to go there next about how is it that you're investigating these, but let's just kind of spend a moment figuring out why this is happening. In other words, is this at the moment considered to be an effort to try to steal company assets, to steal data, or is there other reasons why the North Korean government may be pushing for this type of practice? Landon, I don't know what you have seen on that question.
Sure. Generally, what we see is a little bit combination of everything. We've investigated probably 15 to 20 of these types of cases. In our cases, it's really just ultimately payroll fraud and just individuals getting payroll to ultimately facilitate the DPRK weapons program, as we've seen in the recent DOJ indictments. There's certainly been, again, when we look at the scale of this activity, we're talking about a scale of in the hundreds and thousands across the world. And when you look at that kind of scale, you obviously, there's definitely malware that's happening. There's definitely a little bit of exfiltration. In the broader sense, I think it's mostly payroll fraud that is actually just using and benefiting the DPRK weapons program. Have been isolated instances of exfiltration and malware that are being put down. CrowdStrike has come out and pulled together a lot of research on this as well. And I think the broad sense, it's mostly just payroll fraud at a mass scale that I don't think that we're still really trying to come to grasp with.
So payroll fraud in this context would be, it's quite as simple as they're looking to get money from the wages from these individuals in order to funnel at least a portion of that money over to fund the government, especially when the government has sanctions applied to it and they're ways unable to access capital in the same way as other organizations or other companies.
No, that's absolutely accurate. I mean, they are using a certain set of U.S. financial institutions that then are able to convert that money to cryptocurrency, and then ultimately are siphoning that back to North Korea, is what we've seen, and certainly what the DOJ indictments have implicated. And again, it's quite a complex network of U.S.-based facilitators that are sometimes wittingly and unwittingly going and facilitating this type of activity. The DOJ indictment that was called out, you had an individual based in Arizona that was setting up a laptop farm, in Arizona. And we've seen this in 6 or 7 different U.S. states of these various laptop farms that are used to facilitate the activity. And then, of course, you have a pretty vast financial ecosystem as well that's able to get the money back to North Korea.
So we have law enforcement, right, engaging, hopefully, to be able to address this issue. I mean, I guess, Dan, as I'm thinking about this in the context of our overall insider threat programs and as part of your overall cybersecurity risk management component, we have long talked about issues surrounding, moles within an organization, plants within an organization, potential compromises through extortion campaigns of individuals inside of an organization to start to leak IP, leak other types of data that may be of sensitive nature or that may present value to a nation state. I think maybe this is in some ways similar to that, but also I think probably a very orchestrated effort to try to attack perhaps weaknesses in the overall hiring process that maybe has never really been thought of as a traditional cybersecurity issue. Interested in your perspective on how you see organizations having to adapt to their hiring processes to now think of hiring as also a cybersecurity threat.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways that organizations can adapt. As Landon mentioned, some of this is done more at the HR level than necessarily just being done at the technical level, but there certainly is a mix. Some of the ways that we have seen victims adapt, or we've advised other clients who are trying to get in front of this to adapt, is by revisiting their background investigation processes. As Landon said, a lot of times after you go back and you investigate and peel the onion, you do recognize these inconsistencies. So having processes to escalate to people within your company if it does appear that there is some sort of inconsistency or something that just isn't matching up, that you are going through and reconciling the social media profile to the other sources. But in addition to all those background investigation processes, there's also the more direct hiring recruitment process, as far as taking additional steps as part of video interviews to have people match their ID, making sure everything is on camera, that people are appearing as matching their profiles elsewhere. And then once folks are hired, some controls that we talk about generally in the IT space, but certainly helping for situations like this, such as limiting the amount of access folks may get upon first being hired, making sure things are segmented, not allowing use of other VPNs. A lot of times we've seen other VPN software present in these scenarios, and then insider threat monitoring software that more sophisticated organizations can do to try to help identify potential situations, particularly when we are concerned about data theft or malware installation.
I want to pause for a moment on that first part where you're talking about the background check process, because that's an area that we'll frequently get questions about what levels of background checks are needed. And I think background checks historically haven't been used as a traditional cybersecurity threat prevention mechanism. They've served other purposes. And as a result, we're now kind of thinking about those background checks perhaps differently than we have before. And the amount of resources and scrutiny that needs to be applied to those background checks probably also now has changed in light of these threats. And then I think importantly, the other flag that I would provide, I'm interested in both of your perspectives, is that I believe most of these threats have been targeted at remote working positions and not as opposed to in-person, which obviously would be much more difficult to pull off for this. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I'll start there. I 100% agree. And Dan, you really covered quite a bit. I think a couple key facets are HR really needs to monitor email address. The way that they're creating email addresses is very descriptive of this activity. Another classic indicator is matching the I-9 address to where the remote device is going to be shipped, right? So oftentimes we see an I-9 address, and then all of a sudden there is a request because somebody moved to ultimately ship that location, that address is somewhere different. And really, they're not moving. It's because they're shipping that laptop to a facilitator, right? So I think that is a classic. Then when you pair that with the classic things that Dan talked about, like they're not showing up on camera on the interview, that's where like the spidey sense really kind of needs to escalate. We've even seen with our clients and working with overhauling procedures, and again, this isn't applicable for a lot of companies, but for companies that do have a headquarters, they're requiring IT-based employees or remote-based employees to come to the office, right? They're requiring them to come to the office to have that initial check-in, regardless if they're going to be remote. But that's something we've seen implemented at mass scale as just one potential solution. So I think those are the couple of the key indicators, and we'll probably get into some of how this is investigated as well. But Dan, welcome your thoughts as well.
Yeah, certainly agree. Very happy you hit on the laptop redirection, because that's a classic indicator. And certainly, as you also talked about with remediation, having folks pick up laptops in person, it's the key way of circumventing that. I did want to discuss, one thing that came down from the recent DOJ indictments, which was interesting, is there was a U.S. citizen involved where, recognizing some of these controls organizations are put in place, he did appear for the video interview and claimed to be who he was, and even showed up at a few in-person meetings. This was rare. This shows a different level of sophistication. This U.S. citizen was taking a percentage of the wages earned as part of the scheme. So while we're citing these as examples and certainly are great practices, I do want to say that even if you do have certain elements of coming in, it's not necessarily foolproof, at least for these more sophisticated campaigns that may occur.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested then what organizations do as part of their investigation following the potential that they have become victim of this fraud. So each of you have mentioned a number of IOCs, a number of areas where it's like, hey, something may be off here, which may have been picked up by, human eyes. They said it's like, hey, this person is not showing up for work. This seems odd. The references didn't seem like I was talking to a real person. Or it could be, something that we've picked up through system controls and safeguards. DLP alerts have gone off, or other kind of other indicators. From each of your perspectives, maybe Landon, I'll ask you, because I know you do a lot of these investigations. How do you start an investigation like this? And importantly, kind of where do you try to gather the information necessary to understand whether this is something that's a coordinated fraudulent effort, or perhaps maybe just an employee who is not good at her job or his job?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, back to that email address, right? There's short ways and there's long ways. Short ways, look at the email address, ask records if they've been on camera, and look for the references. And if the references have been used multiple times and are the same individual, very quick triage that can lead to these things. If they're more sophisticated, what we've generally seen is almost a technical steps that's a little bit longer of an investigation, but it always usually starts with an unauthorized remote access software. So your AnyDesk, your Google Chrome, various VPN tunneling signatures that are there. Sometimes there's unauthorized VPN activity if they've made a mistake and they're supposed to be they're supposed to be based in a certain state and the VPN comes out of that certain state. We'll go to the next step. But then oftentimes if you take a look at the VPN and it is coming out of like Astral VPN out of China, again, clear indicator. Okay, let's say they look at their VPN. It's also coming out of the state that they are. We go another step further, and that is usually custom scripts. A lot of organizations use something similar to Tanium. So they use, a software, that ultimately is able to, get a lay of the land of the entire ecosystem. And so there's certainly custom scripts and Tanium scripts that you can send out to the entire enterprise that ultimately gathers a list of Wi-Fi access points around that laptop, right? Because, if you're a general counsel, you're immediately thinking, okay, I might have identified one. How many more are there? Right? Like that's always the question you're going to ask. Well, so the way that we can get to that very quickly is then use those custom scripts to query Wi-Fi around the laptop. And this is a pretty telltale sign, right? So if the VPN is in a certain state, the address is in a certain state, but the wireless access points around that laptop are in another state or in another country, now we've really honed this in. And this can be, by the way, queried in the matter of hours, and the analysis can be done in the matter of, a couple of days. They're ultimately able to kind of get the full breadth. And if we're talking about numerous different actors, that's useful. Now, of course, something that your infosec individuals say, well, what if they turned off, the Wi-Fi on the laptop? What if they're hardwiring in, right? Even if they're hardwiring in, they're usually not turning off the Wi-Fi check. And again, that just requires a couple more manual steps to turn back on the Wi-Fi access on the computer to where you can see surrounding, BSSIDs and Wi-Fi access points around that laptop. So hopefully that wasn't too technical for your listeners, but I think that's some of the different ways that we've been able to kind of get broader and answer that question of, is this an isolated case or is this a broader case?
Yeah, interesting. Sometimes in this particular space, it starts to feel like at least I feel like I'm, no longer operating as a lawyer at a big law firm. Instead, I feel like I'm in a spy novel or, in a national security kind of situation, because you feel like you have these almost like these sleeper cells inside of an organization, and, similar that they don't actually know of each other. And so, they're not kind of interacting together. And so any one of those individuals may not know of the 3, 4, 5, 6, 100 other people who are essentially doing the same kind of thing. But one of the things is thematic. And, Dan, I know you and I have worked together a bunch on these types of concerns, is around tipping. Right. In other words, what we're very concerned about is making sure we can do an investigation without necessarily telling the subject of the investigation that this is happening. Otherwise, our efforts on data collection and evidence collection and ability of us trying to root out not only one bad guy, but all of the other bad guys on the who may be involved gets compromised. Just interested in how you would do the types of investigation you described, Landon, in ways that are designed to not also tell the data subject or the investigation subject that you're doing it.
Yeah, Scott, it's very much an issue because, as you mentioned, oftentimes these are orchestrated as broader, where it can be individuals acting without one another's knowledge. At the same time, it can be part of a broader scheme where they are working together. A lot of how we do this is by when outside counsel is brought in and we work with a team like Landon's or another group to assist with the investigation. It's doing the initial data gathering upfront in a way that wouldn't necessarily trigger any of the perpetrators knowing. There's a lot of, especially if a company has robust logging, has tools to identify certain activities, makes it much easier upfront for us to get a lay of the land of who may be involved and what information can we gather at that point. And only when we feel like we have a good sense of who's, persons of interest, people of interest, at that point will we maybe go and do an interview or something that would be more indicative of them being under investigation. At that point, again, we normally have taken the steps to collect any forensic evidence that we need just in case they do try to backtrack, delete things, reach out to other folks. There's a lot of groundwork that we would lay beforehand because you're absolutely right. We've encountered this where as soon as you reach out to one person, investigations have a short shelf life because as much as you can tell people not to talk, they're going to talk, particularly if they feel like it's in their best interest because it's part of a broader scheme.
And double back on everything that Dan said, absolutely accurate. I think it's just a question of least privilege. You want a tight team really led by outside counsel, inside counsel, one or two people from the security team, as well as somebody from, a investigative resource, potentially, from a third party, like NISOS. Oftentimes, when we're talking about IT employees, they are people with access. If they have local admin privileges, if they have, higher escalation privileges, they could potentially see, the activity of what's being done against them. Some of those techniques that I was talking about of, running, scripts against their computer. There's a way to do it that's very noisy and a way to do that's very quiet where they're not going to be tipped off. I think that usually, reducing privileges, ultimately kind of going about, at least in our instances, we've usually taken these investigations and it's been business as usual for the, potential, suspect or person of interest. And, realistically, and again, depending on the sophistication of the security team, there's quite a bit of ways to monitor them invasively or passively, where you ultimately, because it's a risk assessment, right? Like we don't want them exfiltrating information if they think that they're now a suspect or a person of interest. And I think that's what you always have to kind of weigh. And in these cases that we've seen, there's usually there has not been a large exfiltration risk. But there's certainly ways to monitor for that as you kind of work through just the options of confirming that it is a fraudulent employee and you need to take administrative action. But these things are always very delicate, but I think that, the item of least privilege and having a close circle that's investigating this is usually pretty common.
Really great insight in terms of how is it that we would put forward this investigation as we start to gather evidence and try to understand what is it that happened. I think you both mentioned a number of potential outcomes here. Everything from just being this as a payroll scheme to data exfiltration to uses of malware, all of which I think have significant legal implications. Maybe Dan, interested in your perspective as you're doing this investigation, that this is going to be part traditional cyber and probably implicate many more areas from sanctions to HR to employment, IP, kind of a number of other areas. Interested in your perspective on the legal issues that we would be considering throughout this investigation and as part of the objectives of the investigation.
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. Certainly, in many ways, it depends where the investigation leads, what legal implications there are, but a lot of areas of law are touched on by this. You have, as Landon mentioned, the employee monitoring upfront. Have you made sure that you've gotten authorization to conduct more employee monitoring as to allow you to conduct a thorough investigation? If there is data exfiltration or malware installation, or access to personal data that looks to be part of the scheme, very different investigation than something that is pure wage theft in terms of legal implications. But regardless of what the full scope is, the FBI certainly has requested folks to report this across the board. And then beyond that, for certain industries, you may have additional contractual obligations, particularly if you are government contractor, and this may have been a actor or people involved in the scheme who may have had access to sensitive data in that space. It looks different, your legal obligations, than someone who, again, is just pure wage theft. So this is where your in-house counsel, outside counsel can help you and direct the investigations, that you're making sure that you're checking those boxes and considering all the different potential obligations and considerations.
Yeah. So you may have made a payment to an agent of a sanctioned organization, which is going to obviously create a number of issues for which you would want to be thinking about OFAC reporting and obviously working with law enforcement in connection with that.
Yeah, absolutely. A key thing there in any situation where you may have made a payment to a sanctioned entity is if you have done that law enforcement outreach, which I know folks often are concerned about, and you have a separate podcast about recently, so not going to go into all the considerations there, but the FBI does consider folks to be victims here, and they're trying to gather the information they need. But OFAC, as part of their guidance, has been very clear that cooperation and reporting to law enforcement is considered a very significant mitigating factor in the event that there was some sort of improper payment made.
And Dan, just to kind of maybe double click on something you mentioned around the exfiltration point or access point. I mean, this particular fact pattern, I think, has really put a new lens on thinking about some of our traditional data breach notification obligations, which often, can be summarized as saying, any breach of security which results in unauthorized access or acquisition of data that compromises the privacy or cyber or security or confidentiality of the data. And then there's traditional exceptions that, good faith access by an employee is not going to be considered as a breach. Interestingly, though, if you look at those and say, well, what happens if the employee who is by these statutes assumed to be a good actor is actually also the person who is the threat actor? Does the employee, in performing her role or his role as it was described, become the unauthorized access or acquisition of the data? Kind of a real different way of thinking about how these statutes would apply to this very specific and nuanced use case.
Yeah, absolutely. That's going to be fact specific, but to your point, there's a reason why it's called the good faith exception. If you have a remote employee who's not acting in good faith, it's harder to apply that exception. But you would want to see, was this in the minority of instances where the purpose of the data was for improper access or exfiltration, or does this appear to be any access they had was completely ancillary and really wasn't the goal of what their activity was. It was just something that they had because, as Landon pointed out, these are IT workers and a lot of them have very escalated privileges. Again, another reason why you want to have a thorough investigation to help you come to any conclusions on the level of access and any reporting obligations.
Yeah. Landon, maybe as we kind of wind up here, I'm interested in your perspective on where you think this type of threat will go in the future. How is it that the threat actors will start to develop, and to look to become perhaps more sophisticated in their activities. I'm thinking, for example, of the increased use that I know we have each seen with the use of deepfakes and different types of AI mechanisms to perpetuate fraud and use that to increase cybersecurity threats. From your perspective, is this something that's a flash in the pan, or do you feel like this is going to be a long-term issue that organizations want to be getting out in front of?
I mean, when it comes to North Korea, everybody that I've talked to around these investigations, they're often awestruck in the types of sophistication and complexity that they are willing to go to finance whatever they need to finance. As one of my colleagues and fellow co-founder Vincent Shajunas has done quite a bit of research just on the infrastructure, of this entirety of the operation. Again, like I was saying earlier in the podcast, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of potential, not just people, but just different, email addresses and technical infrastructure types of points. And I think that, to your point around deep fakes and the ability to circumvent, different types of detection and monitoring are only going to get better and more complex. I mean, again, if you would have asked me 5 years ago, would North Korea go to these levels of extreme to fund a weapons program? I mean, I would not have been able to pinpoint. I mean, I think they've been long involved in crypto heists and, different thefts of a variety of different, areas within cybersecurity, to actually embed IT employees. Like who would have put that on the radar 5 years ago? And, here we are talking about this in, pretty granular details to say that they wouldn't use deep fakes and install technologies where they don't make mistakes in VPN usage. And, they're actually able to use routine IT mechanisms to ultimately be an employee. That's absolutely going to be their use case and their MO for now until the future. I mean, that's just the way they've operated for the past 50 years. So yeah, it's only going to grow in sophistication, and the different types of HR policies and the different types of technical monitoring programs and cybersecurity programs that you have to put in place are going to just have to constantly be adaptive, and going to need just more coordination between cybersecurity and physical security and HR and engineering. It's really a full enterprise type of defense that you have to put in place.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like I know that many of my cyber clients over the years have remarked that it's so much easier for them to put in controls and safeguards to protect against technical risks as opposed to addressing human risks, which in some ways are the most difficult ones. And this is really just putting that on its head and kind of weaponizing workforce members as a new cybersecurity vulnerability that is intentional, in addition to the normal, errant employee behavior that cybersecurity professionals try to control for. Maybe we give you, maybe each of you, one last question, and maybe it's the same. I think each of you have kind of had some of these points as listeners are thinking about this and saying, "Oh boy, what can I do to now in light of this particular threat, or even past potential hires that may have not been legitimate?" From your perspective, one or two practice points, maybe rapid fire form. Dan, just ask you to go first.
Yeah. Before I answer the question, I do want to point out that it's the scale when we're looking forward. I mean, they're already making hundreds of millions of dollars, what the FBI is indicating. So it's very much, the incentives are there, and they're just going to get more sophisticated with their tactics. As far as what companies can do, rapid fire, I would say is revisit your background investigation and screening processes to make sure that you're putting in some of these very low effort but high impact safeguards to reconcile, to do outreach and confirmation of references, and to recognize triggers such as the forwarding of laptops to a different location so that you can at least easily thwart some of the less sophisticated activity.
Great point. Landon.
Rapid fire, realistically, cybersecurity, HR, legal, and even sometimes engineering really have to come together and develop playbooks. There are very prescriptive playbooks from a regular IT employment fraud perspective that are overlap very much with DPRK threat actors. Understanding those playbooks from an HR perspective, a technical perspective, and also legal perspective, having those playbooks in place, can really benefit. And again, like I said, I mean, the more sophisticated clients, have processes set up where where HR detects these and they're immediately forwarding them to law enforcement. Now, look, those are companies that are 50,000 employees, right? That's a scale. If you're a 1,000 person company and you're still having, mature security program or maturing security program, you might not need or want to have that type of, relationship with law enforcement or the regulation. And that's reasonable. I think it's just important just to have those playbooks in mind so you're just ultimately ready and ultimately you can respond quickly and get back to business as usual.
Yeah, really great point. And I would add that playbook probably is going to be the outcome of early and probably often collaboration between legal, cyber, and HR, which, frankly, I think legal and cyber nowadays work together very well. But HR tends to often be not worked together with cybersecurity professionals on a day-to-day basis. And now I think to get out in front of these threats, those two teams really need to be joining forces in order to both be in the position of proactively preventing and then also addressing whenever it does happen.
No, absolutely. I mean, Scott, you probably have questions all the time from internal counsel. We need to do something about insider threat, right? Well, okay. Well, what exactly does that mean? What you need to actually pinpoint what is going to happen at scale. For somebody to have an espionage concern where somebody's actually paying off your employees, that's probably a lower chance than something like, IT worker fraud or case scam. So, I mean, oftentimes with large companies that have a remote IT function, these are probably going to be the types of insider threat risks that are just higher on the priority scale. And I think that this is a time where, folks like Hogan Lovells can, really, obviously work with, an entire stakeholder engagement to ultimately have, to start, formulating those playbooks because they're, absolutely critical.
One thing I just wanted to add, because I think you hit on something important. We've talked a lot about the prevention here, but you talked about when it does happen. And I do want to make sure we talk about that you have more robust logging and processes to detect it or to investigate it. One of the things, as we talk about insider threats broadly, because these are insiders, we tend not to have all the time as robust of logging or monitoring of them because there's a certain level of trust. And certainly, you do want to entrust your employees, or even if they're remote employees, that you have mechanisms in place is really going to assist on the investigation side. And as we do talk about concerns, if there was data exfiltration or malware installation, having, again, tools in place to help you identify the risk is really going to be key. Because as much as we talk about prevention up front, there are going to be people who get through as sophistication grows. So it's going to really serve your company well to have those detective mechanisms.
Well, super helpful points for each of you. And Landon, thank you for coming to the podcast and sharing NISOS's expertise and experience on these. And Dan, thank you for continuing to come to the podcast and giving your unique cyber perspective on this. Always feel like I learn so much when I speak with both of you, and I really appreciate your sharing your thoughts and experiences with the audience.
Thank you for having me on the show.
You, Scott.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.